Hello, this is Morel with Love Story, Love Among the Haystacks, the continuing story of Love Story, Love Among the Haystacks. Last words were that he went slithering over the edge of the stack, and by the way, please subscribe and please share. Geoffrey turned white to the lips and remained standing, listening. He heard the fall. Then a flush of darkness came over him, and he remained standing only because he was planted. He had not strength to move. He could hear no sound from below, was only faintly aware of a sharp shriek from a long way off. He listened again. Then he filled with sudden panic. "Father!" he roared in his tremendous voice. "Father! Father!" The valley re-echoed at the sound. Small cattle on the hillside looked up. Men's figures came running round from the bottom field, and much nearer, a woman's figure was racing across the upper field. Geoffrey waited in terrible suspense. "Ah!" he heard the strange, wild voice of the girl cry out, "Ah!" And then some foreign wailing speech. Then, "Ah! Are you dead?" He stood suddenly erect on the stack, not daring to go down, longing to hide in the hay, but too sullen to stoop out of sight. He heard his eldest brother come up panting. "Whatever is amiss?" And then the labourer, and then his father. "Whatever have you been doing?" he heard his father ask, while yet he had not come round the corner of the stack, and then, in a low, bitter tone, He's done for. I'd no business to have put it all on the stack." There was a moment or two of silence. Then the voice of Henry, the eldest brother, said crisply, "He's not dead. He's coming round." Geoffrey heard, but was not glad. He had as life Maurice was dead. At least that would be final. Better than meeting his brother's charges and of seeing his mother pass to the sick room. If Maurice was killed, he himself would not explain, no, not a word, and they could hang him if they liked. If Maurice were only hurt, then everybody would know, and Geoffrey could never lift his face again. What added torture to pass along everybody knowing? He wanted something that he could stand back to, something definite, if it were only the knowledge that he had killed his brother. He must have something firm to back up to, or he would go mad. He was so lonely. He who above all needed the support of sympathy. No, he's coming to. I tell you he is," said the labourer. He's not dead, came the passionate, strained sing-song of the foreign girl. "He's not dead, no." "He wants some brandy. Look at the colour of his lips," said the crisp, cold voice of Henry. "Can you fetch some?" "What? Fetch, Fräulein?" Did not understand. "Brandy," said Henry, very distinct. "Brandy," she re-echoed. "You go, Bill," groaned the father. I'll go," replied Bill, and he ran across the field. Maurice was not dead, nor going to die. This Geoffrey now realised. He was glad, after all, that the extreme penalty was revoked, but he hated to think of himself going on. He would always shrink now. He had hoped for the time when he would be careless, bold as Maurice, when he would not wince and shrink. Now he would always be the same, coiling up in himself like a tortoise with no shell. He's getting better," came the wild voice of the Fraulein, and she began to cry, a strange sound, that startled the men, made the animal bristle within them. Geoffrey shuddered as he heard, between her sobbing, the impatient moaning of his brother as the breath came back. The labourer returned at a run, followed by the vicar. Out of the brandy, Maurice made more moaning, hiccuping noise. Geoffrey listened in torture. He heard the vicar asking for explanations. All the united, anxious voices replied in brief phrases. "It was that other," cried the Fraulein. "He knocked him over, ha!" She was shrill and vindictive. "I don't think so," said the father to the vicar in a quite audible but private tone, speaking as if the Fraulein did not understand his English. The vicar addressed his children's governess in bad German. She replied in a torrent when he would not confess was too much for him. Maurice was making little moaning, sighing noises. "Where's your pain, boy, eh?" the father asked pathetically. "Leave him alone a bit," came the cool voice of Henry. "He's winded, if no more." "You'd better see that no bones are broken," said the anxious vicar. "It were a blessing as he should ha' dropped on that heap of hay just there," said the labourer. "If he'd happened to have catched himself on this nog of wood, he would have stood much no chance." Geoffrey wondered when he would have had courage to venture down. He had wild notions of pitching himself head foremost from the stack. If he could only extinguish himself, he would be safe. Quite frantically, he longed not to be. The idea of going through life thus coiled up within himself in morbid self-consciousness, always lonely, surly, and a misery, was enough to make him cry out. What would they all think when they knew he had knocked Maurice off that haystack? They were talking to Maurice down below. The lad had recovered in great measure and was able to answer faintly. What were you doing?" the father asked gently. "Was you playing about with our Geoffrey?" "Aye, and where is he?" Geoffrey's heart stood still. "I dunno," said Henry in a curious, ironic tone. "Go and have a look," pleaded the father, infinitely relieved over one son, anxious now concerning the other. Geoffrey could not bear that his eldest brother should climb up and question him in his high-pitched drawl of curiosity. The culprit doggedly set his feet on the ladder. His nailed boots slipped a rung. "Mind yourself," shouted the overwrought father. Geoffrey stood like a criminal at the foot of the ladder, glancing furtively at the group. Maurice was lying, pale and slightly convulsed, upon a heap of hay. The Fraulein was kneeling behind his head. The vicar had the lad's shirt full open down the breast and was feeling for broken ribs. The father kneeled on the other side. The labourer and Henry stood aside. "I can't find anything broken," said the vicar, and he sounded slightly disappointed. "There's naught broken to find," murmured Maurice, smiling. The father started. "Eh," he said, "eh," and he bent over the invalid. "I say it's not hurt me," repeated Maurice. "What were you doing?" asked the cold, ironic voice of Henry. Geoffrey turned his head away. He had not yet raised his face. "Nowt, as I know on," he muttered in a surly tone. "Why?" cried Fraulein in a reproachful tone. "I see him. Knock him over." She made a fierce gesture with her elbow. Henry curled his long moustache sardonically. "Nay, lass, never," smiled the vain Maurice. He was far enough away from me when I slipped." "Oh, ah," cried the Fräulein, not understanding. "Ye," smiled Maurice indulgently. "I think you're mistaken," said the father, rather pathetically, smiling at the girl as if she were wanting. "Oh, no," she cried, "I see him." "Nay, lass," smiled Maurice quietly. She was a Pole, named Paula Jabloneski, young, only 20 years old, swift, and light as a wild cat with a strange wild cat way of grinning. Her hair was blonde and full of life, all crisped into many tendrils with vitality shaking round her face. Her fine blue eyes were peculiarly lidded, and she seemed to look piercingly, then languorously, like a wild cat. She had somewhat Slavonic cheekbones, and was very much freckled. It was evident that the vicar, a pale, rather cold man, hated her. Maurice lay pale and smiling in her lap, while she cleaved to him like a mate. One felt instinctively that they were mated. She was ready at any minute to fight with ferocity in his defence, now he was hurt. Her looks at Geoffrey were full of fierceness. She bowed over Maurice and caressed him with a foreign-sounding English. "You say what you like," she laughed, giving him lordship over her. "Hadn't you better be going and looking what has become of Marjorie?" asked the vicar in tones of reprimand. "She's with her mother. I heard her. I will go in a while," smiled the girl coolly. "Do you feel as if you could stand?" asked the father, still anxiously. "Aye, in a bit," smiled Maurice. "You want to get up?" caressed the girl, bowing over him till her face was not far from his. "I'm in no hurry," he replied, smiling brilliantly. This accident had given him quite a strange new ease and authority. He felt extraordinarily glad new power had come to him all at once. "You're in no hurry," she repeated, gathering his meaning. She smiled tenderly. She was in his service. "She leaves us in another month." Mrs. Inwood could stand no more of her, apologized the vicar quietly to the father. "Why is she?" "Like a wild thing, disobedient and insolent." "Ah." The father sounded abstract. "No more foreign governesses for me." Maurice stirred and looked up at the girl. "Do you stand up?" she asked brightly. "You well?" He laughed again, showing his teeth winsomely. She lifted his head, sprung to her feet, her hand still holding his head. Then she took him under the armpits and had him on his feet before anyone could help. He was much taller than she. He grasped her strong shoulders heavily, leaned against her, and feeling her round, firm breast doubled up against his side, he smiled, catching his breath. "You see, I'm all right," he gasped. "I was only winded." "You all right?" she cried in great glee. "Yes, I am." He walked a few steps after a moment. "There's now ailed me, father," he laughed. "Quite well, you," she cried in a pleading tone. He laughed outright, looked down at her, touching her cheek with his fingers. "That's it, if thou likes." "If I like," she repeated, radiant. "She's going at the end of 3 weeks," said the vicar consolingly to the father. While they were talking, they heard the far-off hooting of a pit. "There goes the loser," said Henry coldly. "We're not going to get that corner up today." The father looked round anxiously. "Now, Maurice, are you sure you're all right?" he asked. Yes, I'm all right, haven't I told you? Then you sit down there, and in a bit you can be getting dinner out. Henry, you go onto the stack. Where's Jim? Oh, he's minding the horses. Bill, and you, Geoffrey, you can pick while Jim loads. Maurice sat down under the well elm to recover. The Fräulein had fled back. He made up his mind to ask her to marry him. He had got £50 of his own, and his mother would help him. For a long time he sat, musing, thinking what he would do. Then from the float he fetched a big basket covered with a cloth and spread the dinner. There was an immense rabbit pie, a dish of cold potatoes, much bread, a great piece of cheese, and a solid rice pudding. These two fields were 4 miles from the home farm, but they had been in the hands of the Wookiees for several generations. Therefore, the father kept them on, and everyone looked forward to the hay harvest at Greasley. It was a kind of picnic. They brought dinner and tea in the milk float, which the father drove over in the morning. The lads and the labourers cycled. Off and on the harvest lasted a fortnight. As the high road from Alfreton to Nottingham ran at the foot of the fields, someone usually slept in the hay under the shed to guard the tools. The sons took it in turns. They did not care for it much and were, for that reason, anxious to finish the harvest on this day. But work went slack and disjointed after Maurice's accident. When the load was teamed, they gathered around the white cloth which was spread under a tree between the hedge and the stack, and sitting on the ground, ate their meal. Mrs. Wookey sent always a clean cloth and knives and forks and plates for everybody. Mr. Wookey was always rather proud of this spread. Everything was so proper. There now, he said, sitting down jovially. Doesn't this look good? Nice now, huh? They all sat round the white spread in the shadow of the tree and the stack, and looked out up the fields as they ate. From their shady coolness, the gold sward seemed liquid, molten with heat. The horse with the empty wagon wandered a few yards and stood feeding. Everything was still as a trance. Now and again, the horse between the shafts of the load that stood propped beside the stack jingled his loose bit as he ate. The men ate and drank in silence, the father reading the newspaper, Maurice leaning back on a saddle, Henry reading The Nation, the others eating busily. Presently, "Halloa, here's again," exclaimed Bill. All looked up. Paula was coming across the field carrying a plate. "She's bringing something to tempt your appetite, Maurice," said the eldest brother ironically. Maurice was midway through a large wedge of rabbit pie and some cold potatoes. "Aye, bless me if she's not," laughed the father. "Put that away, Maurice. It's a shame to disappoint her." Maurice looked round, very shamefaced, not knowing what to do with his plate. "Give it over here," said Bill. "I'll polish him off." "Bring in something for the invalid," laughed the father to the Fräulein. "He's looking up nicely." "I bring him some chicken, him." She nodded her head at Maurice childishly. He flushed and smiled. "That doesn't mean to bust 'em," said Bill. Everybody laughed aloud. The girl did not understand, so she laughed also. Maurice ate his portion very sheepishly. The father pitied his son's shyness. "Come here and sit by me," he said. "Hey, Fräulein, is that what they call you?" "I sit by you, father," she said innocently. Henry threw his head back and laughed long and noiselessly. She settled near to the big, handsome man. My name, she says, is Paula Jablonski. Is what? Said the father, and the other men went into roars of laughter. Tell me again, said the father, your name. Paula. Paula. Oh, well, it's a rum sort of name, eh? His name. He nodded at his son. Maurice. I know. She pronounced it sweetly, then laughed into the father's eyes. Maurice blushed to the roots of his hair. They questioned her concerning her history and made out that she came from Hanover, that her father was a shopkeeper, and that she had run away from home because she did not like her father. She had gone to Paris. Oh, said the father, now dubious. And what did you do there? In school. In a young ladies' school. Did you like it? Oh, no. No life. No life. What? When we go out two and two all together, no more. And no life. No life. Well, that's a winder, exclaimed the father. No life in Paris. And have you found much life in England? No, I don't like it. She made a grimace at the vicarage. How long have you been in England? Christmas so. And what will you do? I will go to London or to Paris, Paris, or get married. She laughed into the father's eyes. The father laughed heartily. Get married, eh? And who to? I don't know. I'm going away. The country's too quiet for you, asked the father. Too quiet? She nodded in assent. You wouldn't care for making butter and cheese? Making butter? She turned to him with a glad, bright gesture. I like it. Oh, laughed the father. You would you? She nodded vehemently, with glowing eyes. She'd like anything in the shape of a change, said Henry judicially. I think she would, agreed the father. It did not occur to them that she fully understood what they said. She looked at them closely, then thought with bowed head. Hello, exclaimed Henry, the alert. A tramp was slouching towards them through the gap. He was a very seedy, slinking fellow with a twang of horsey braggadocio about him, small, thin, and ferrety, with a week's red beard bristling on his pointed chin. He came slouching forward. Have you got a bit of a job going? He asked. A bit of a job? Repeated the father. Why can't you see as we've a'most done? Aye, but I noticed you was a hand short, and I thought it happened you'd give me half a day. What are you good at? In a hay's clothes? Asked Henry with a sneer. The man stood slouching against the haystack, all the others seated on the floor. He had an advantage. I could work aside on you, he bragged. That looks good, laughed Bill. And what's your regular trade? Asked the father. I'm a jockey by rights, but I did a bit of dirty work for a boss of mine as I was landed. He got the benefit. I got kicked out. He asked me, and then he looked as if he'd never seen me. Did he, though? Exclaimed the father sympathetically. He did that, asserted the man. But we've got nothing for you, said Henry coldly. What does the boss say? Asked the man impudently. Join me for Love Story. Continuing story of Love Story, Love Among the Haystacks. Join me for the next video, and please subscribe and share the next video of Love Story, Love Among the Haystacks. See you then, Morel.